Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel Dr. Asi Explains. This is Dr. Asi and today's topic is evolution of populations. This is chapter 11 in the Orange Book, Concepts of Biology. So let's get started. So there, last topic was DNA technology. Now we're switching to actually a totally different topic, which is more about evolution of populations, which is also linked to the next chapter, which is macroevolution that often comes after this chapter. So we have learning outcomes for students. First one is evolution, which is student will be familiar with the key concepts of that proposed by Charles Darwin: common ancestry, natural selection, mutations and genetic variation in evolution and gradual change. And we will talk about evolutionary evidences and will analyze and interpret evidences for evolution using molecular biology, experimental studies, biogeography, embryology, and also we'll talk about evolutionary mechanisms. So there is evidences like comparative anatomy, molecular biology, biogeography, fossils, records, direct observation, homologies, right? These are evidences, but there are mechanisms like one like very well known one, which is natural selection, but also there is genetic drift, gene flow, among others like founder effect and bottleneck effect. So we will talk about this. So there are vocabulary, there are a number of vocabulary in this chapter that you can actually start making flashcards to study. Obviously, biological evolution, carbon dating, Charles Darwin, cladograms. So to start with, and then continuing with natural selection, biogeography, fossil records and homologies. Okay, so let's get started. So this chapter opening starts with an experiment in 1955, WHO, which started a campaign to eradicate malaria. So the strategy was killing all the mosquitoes carries the parasites from person to person. They use a chemical called DDT, which was a pesticide at that time, and basically two massively spraying operations. Although DDT is very strongly kill most mosquitoes, but some mosquitoes survive and they actually give rise to new DDT resistant populations, which is an example of evolution in action. So eradication did not really work as planned. And so you can see in this like in this picture here, basically, if you try to eradicate some populations and if some survive, they become actually resistant. Like bacteria can do that too. They become, like in this case, drug-resistant bacteria, and then multiply and thrive, like we see in some other cases. So WHO now monitors evolution of drug resistance in this parasite population around the world. Okay, so this chapter obviously is about diversity, biodiversity, which also includes taxonomy and systematics. Taxonomy is a biology branch which identify, naming, classifying species, and we know this starts with Carl Linnaeus in 1780s and his two books, and then his system that he actually came up with called binomial system, which depends on a two part naming plants using Latin language, which is genus. First part is genus, and then second part is specific epithet. So how is that related to evolution? Well, if any two species who are under the same genus, obviously that shows a very close relationship or closest evolutionary relationship, and very likely they have most recent common ancestors. So these two are almost interchangeable, same thing, closest evolutionary relationship and most recent common ancestor. Okay, so um and explaining diversity of life again, evolution started before 1800s. We have studies actually much before that, and then so even it goes back to the Aristotle's, which idea of fixed species. That species that according to Aristotle, species are fixed permanent forms and do not change over time. Um, but in 1600, the age of the Earth was estimated about 6,000 years. But as the naturalists start actually finding fossil records and showing actually some data that actually brought up some new estimates. And in 1800s, Lamarck actually also worked on this and proposed that using or not using the body parts, individual may develop certain traits that pass on the offspring. So this chapter focuses on a type of evolution called evolution of populations. Always remember, individuals, species don't evolve. Actually, populations evolve. Individuals by nature selected, but populations evolve. So next chapter, this chapter is also called micro, MICRO evolution, which is also a type of evolution called divergent evolution. Okay, so um, but this chapter and next chapter has a lot in common and they overlap a lot of things. Even the next chapter talks about macro, like big scale, large scale evolutionary patterns, and talks about 3.8 billion years of evolution. So much macro level. This chapter 11 is micro level evolution. Okay, so we start with the earlier studies, but really some of the major studies done by Charles Darwin in his book Origin of Species. So he and then his travels and he actually collecting data and writing his book eventually and publishing his book. So he collected thousands of specimens of fossils, living plants, animals, and then brought them home. And then he actually, one of the observation he talked about was biogeography, okay, which is geographic proximity also, geographic distribution of species, because he visited so many islands and mainlands, and then he actually observed that geographic proximity is a better predictor of relationship among organisms than environment itself. So, and that's actually basically his is like his examples of finches of Galapagos, or ducks and wolves in some other studies. These are also called homologous structures, and then divergent evolution or microevolution. So his work is specifically, I want to point out the Galapagos Islands, and then his work from Galapagos Islands, which is actually geographic distribution compared to the mainland nearby to the islands. Two varieties of Galapagos tortoise, like you can see here. So he specifically actually studied, and you can see the differences. And also he looked at Galapagos marine iguanas, and which having flattened tails, aid in the swimming, similar to but distinct from the land-dwelling iguanas on the islands in South American mainland. So each island had its own distinct variety of these animals, like in this case, giant tortoise. Okay, so and he concluded that the hypothesis that present-day species are descendants of ancient ancestors, which they still resemble in some ways. Okay, so and this was his mechanism for evolution called natural selection. This is one of the well-known mechanism for actually for evolutionary mechanisms. So natural selection is, which is basically differential reproduction or survival, adaptive evolution of the populations to fit specific environments. Okay, so, and then he came up with this theory. In 1859, his book, he published Origin of Species, that's supporting this hypothesis, and evidences he collected using experiments in biology, geology, and paleontology, and then he published in his book. So we have supporting evidences that actually also for this. So some of the evidences are like fossil records, which is paleontology, historical records. So evolution leaves some observable signs. So the imprints remaining of organisms from the past in rocks and other forms. So these dead organisms actually decay rapidly, but hard parts actually stay rich in minerals, stay in the fossils, and then that can actually help us document differences between the past and present day organisms and show many species have become extinct as well, since that's why we have only fossil records. So they appear in rock layers, um, and then we can actually use this data. But fossil record is incomplete. It has gaps, even though it's very useful, but it actually has gaps. So just also want to point out. Um, there are other evolutionary evidences. The one is called homologies. Homology is basically similarities resulting from common ancestry. So if something actually have a common ancestry but diverse, but they have homologous features, like you see here, anatomical signs of you see it in human, cat, whale, and bat. Um, so uh, this basically showed Darwin cited that anatomical similarities among vertebrate forelimbs as evidence of common ancestry. Okay, so homologies is called homologies. They inherited from recent common ancestor. Okay, there is another area that it can be used as an evolutionary evidence, which is molecular biology, which can provide more deeper understanding of homologies and evolutionary history of species from their DNA records. If two species have homologous genes, in this case, we're talking about genes, with sequences that match closely, these sequences must be inherited from relatively recent common ancestor. Okay, so what else? Also, there are some other records like direct observation, maybe and also maybe comparative anatomy. Um, so next, there are evolutionary trees. They are also called phylogenetic trees or phylogenetic trees or cladograms in some other forms. So they basically show and they are built on these homologous features. You can see here blue markers here that they are actually homologous features, and then also they can link everything to a common ancestor. You can see here in number 1 position here. So again, this chapter is about populations, and this is evolution of populations and species under same genus more closely related. Always remember that. So we already talked about natural selections. You can read from the book some more experimental results of natural selections of Darwin's experiments. There is also artificial selection, which is not natural, but artificial selections. Always remember that. So natural selection talks about individuals, evolution talks about population. Always remember that. Okay, nature can amplify and or diminish only heritable traits. So there is more information here. Evolution of pesticide resistance in insects population. You can see here, and again, we're talking about populations, not individuals when we talk about evolution. Okay. So that brings us to the genetic variation, which we've seen in earlier chapters. And mutations, again, we've seen in earlier chapters. Mutation, basically a rare ultimate source of genetic variation, and that can actually can be raw material for evolution. And then new alleles can originate from mutation, a change in nucleotide sequence. So that can also be actually used in evolution. Again, there is more information about mutations. So again, back to the populations. This chapter is about population ecology. I'm sorry, population evolution, evolution of populations. The unit is populations. The evolution unit is populations. Always remember that. Population is group of individuals of same species living in same area and can interbreed. Okay, so there is something also about gene pools. Basically, we are going to talk about also in next chapter about this topic, gene flow, gene pools, larger populations through these some other mechanisms. So in this case, you see a wildflower population with two variations of blooms of different colors. You can see here, and this can be actually calculated using Hardy-Weinberg formula to calculate the frequencies of genotypes in a gene pool from the frequency of alleles or vice versa. And you can see here allele frequencies and genotype frequencies formulas. Population genetics and health science. Now we see some actually this is we see in the food items like in this picture. Public health scientists use Hardy-Weinberg to calculate percentage of human populations carries allele for certain inherited diseases, like in this case phenylketonuria, PKU, a recessive allele that prevents breakdown of phenylalanine and occurs 1 out of 10,000 babies born in the US. So the people with PKU must strictly regulate their diet intake of phenylalanine, and you can see a warning in this Coke, diet soda. So again, this chapter is about microevolution. Basically, next chapter is macro. In microevolution, is a change in a gene pool. Here is comparing micro, which is on the right side, versus macro. Micro is small scale, few generations within species populations. Small changes, and we have experimental evidence that, and then bacterial resistance to antibiotics is a good example. We talked about already some mechanisms. We will talk about these and more mechanisms like genetic drift and bottleneck effect, which are both of them actually genetic drift can be founder effect and bottleneck effect. Genetic drift is the big picture, can be genetic bottleneck and founder effect. So bottleneck and founder effect, which are listed here. Let me highlight it here. So the genetic drift is a change in a gene pool of small population due to chance. Bottleneck effect is example of genetic drift result from a drastic reduction in population size. You can see in these two pictures here. Okay, so this is altogether called gene flow, also can be called migration, which is genetic exchange with another population by interbreeding and reducing differences between populations. So here is more information about bottleneck effect, which is one of the mechanisms. Example is endangered species. And they can be actually severe or temporarily reduced in population size, and some alleles can get lost, maybe by a natural disaster. You can see here, which is bottleneck effect. Okay. Founder effect is a little different than bottleneck, which is small populations colonize a new habitat and increase in number. This is called founder effect. So you can see here a small group split from the main population and then found a new colony, and which is called founder effect. And again, these two altogether is called gene flow in big picture. Nature selection we already talked about, and here are some other mechanisms actually listed here at the bottom of here. Some general outcomes of natural selection is directional selection, disruptive selection, and stabilizing selection. So these are some outcomes of one of the mechanisms which Darwin came up with, which is natural selection. Differential reproduction or survival, and adaptive evolution of populations to fit environments. So there are some connections to the evolution, connection to the antibiotic resistance, which we already covered at the beginning, so you can read about. And there is a summary of actually whole chapter 11, evolution of populations. So this ends our video for chapter 11. And just to recap, closest evolutionary relationships are most recent common ancestor. They are same, and species under same genus more closely related, and individuals mutate, but populations evolve. Only populations evolve. Thanks for watching, and please feel free to comment, subscribe, like, and I will see you in the next video. Happy studying.